Hey y'all, howdy, welcome to One for the Books. I'm Sandra Broadwell, and this is going to be a rapid fire wrap up of recent reads from August, September, and October. I haven't done any monthly wrap-ups for these 3 months, but I have talked about almost every single one of these books already in a variety of different videos. So I'll be sure to link all those videos down below and also up in the corner as we go along through the video. So I think there's only like 4 of these books that I haven't previously mentioned in another video. So I'll spend a little bit longer talking about those, and the rest of them I'll just give the highlights and link to the other videos if you want to hear my more in-depth thoughts about them. I apologize for the harsh lighting, but I thought you guys would appreciate the Grand Canyon, which is what I'm sitting in front of. All the rock cliffs that you can see in the background is Grand Canyon National Park, which I'm going to be exploring in an upcoming vlog that you will see where I'm finishing all my reading goals for the year. So if you want some more beautiful Grand Canyon footage, be sure to check that out, and I will link that down below after it's posted, but this video will be going up first. So I've got my list of books here on my laptop so I don't forget any of them. I read 26 books over these last 3 months, and I have 6 different videos where I covered, like I said, all but 4 of them. I'm filming this on October 29th, so there's a good chance I will finish another book this month before this video goes live, but I'll just include that in my November wrap up because I don't think I'll have quite as much time to film and edit at the end of this month. So with all that being said, let's dive into the books. This first book and the last 3 books that I'm going to talk about are the ones that I haven't mentioned in any other video so far. So the first book is Doctor Who and the Pirate Planet. So this is a very short little book that was based off of a multi-episode serial of The Fourth Doctor written by Douglas Adams, and it was novelized by the author James Goss. I had a really good time with this one. The Fourth Doctor is the actor Tom Baker. I've only seen a handful of episodes of The Fourth Doctor, but I've really enjoyed him as the Doctor, and so picturing him as I was reading this book was a really fun time. He's the one that wears the big crazy scarf. So if you're a Doctor Who fan, I'm sure you know. But this was a really cool story. It was very fun. I actually really enjoyed the writing. It was kind of whimsical and over the top in a very Douglas Adams-y style. The villain was very villainy and cartoony in ways, but it was just like a romp, and I had a really good time reading it. This was recommended to me by my buddy Sept, who actually gave me this book. I didn't bring any of the books out here with me into the wilderness because that would have been an armful, and I don't have all of them with me anymore, but I do have a physical copy of this one thanks to my buddy Sept, so thanks Sept. Basically, the plot for this one is the Doctor is going to a planet to investigate something, and when they get there, everything seems wrong, and they slowly realize that the planet they're on, which is at the coordinates of the planet they were trying to go to, is not the planet they were trying to go to. And so then they're trying to figure out where the planet is that they were trying to get to, why this other planet happens to be here, and what's going on with like the weird vibes they're getting from all the people who live on the planet. The Doctor's companion in this one is another Time Lord, which is the species that he is, and they have a very interesting dynamic. She's very dedicated to like following all of the rules, and the Doctor is a bit more loosey-goosey about his interpretation of how things should be handled. So they have a fun dynamic. Like I said, the villain in this one is like a cyborg and was a very fun character to follow as well. So I had a really good time with this. I think I gave it 3.5 stars. Definitely just straight up brain candy. Number 2 is Alif the Unseen by G. Willow Wilson, and this was one that I included in the Gin and Tonic reading vlog, which I will link below. Alif the Unseen is kind of a contemporary thriller that has some genies in it. It's about a young man who's a hacker in the Arab Spring. He tries to provide internet security for people in his home country so that they can freely post their ideas on the internet without the government finding out about it. And the government tracks him down and he goes on the run. And when he is trying to go into hiding, he meets up with this Djinn who he tries to seek help from about getting him into hiding, and it spirals into this huge mess. There is a little bit of romance involved. They end up going to the world of the Djinn, which was kind of like, you know, like a fairy goblin market type of setting. There's lots of cool desert vibes. There's evil government. This book had a lot going for it. My only complaint was the main character I found a little bit obnoxious in the way that he was a bit obtuse about how he treated women, and that really wasn't addressed in the text, but I had a really fun time with this book. Number 3 is City of Girls by Elizabeth Gilbert. I read this for the vlog called Judging My Friends based on their book recommendations, and this is a historical fiction about a young woman in the 1940s who goes to live with her aunt in New York City, who runs a rundown vaudevillian theater, and she becomes the seamstress for all of the showgirls. It's about her experiences, her partying, and the mistakes that she makes along the way that define the trajectory of the rest of her life. It's told from the perspective of an older woman looking back on her life. It also goes through World War I and her interactions with some soldiers and how that affected her trajectory as well. All right, number 3 was The Golem and the Jinni by Helene Wicker. Again, this is in the Gin and Tonic reading vlog. The Golem and the Jinni is set in the late 1800s. It is about a golem, which is a woman that was made out of clay. She's brought to life as her master is taking her across the sea to go to America, and then her master dies on the boat before they even reach the shore. Golem's only purpose in life is to serve their masters, so it's about her trying to blend in with normal people in New York City and try and figure out the purpose of her life. At the same time, a Djinn lamp is found by a man who restores antiques, and as he's restoring it, he accidentally releases the Djinn, not knowing that it's there, and it's about the Djinn realizing that 1,000 years have passed since he was trapped and enslaved in this lamp. And it's also kind of about him just trying to figure out like what the world is like now, how everything has changed. And when the Golem and the Jinni meet each other, they see kind of the otherness in each other and try and find solace in their relationship. Number 5 is The Dovekeepers by Alice Hoffman. This is a historical fiction set during the First Jewish-Roman War, and it is about the siege of Masada, which was a true event that happened, wherein the Romans, after casting all the Jews out of Jerusalem, tracked them down to a fort in the desert called Masada, where they were trying to eke out an existence. And there were 900 to 1,000 people at this fort. The story is told through the perspective of 4 different women who kept the doves at Masada in an effort to fertilize all of the crops that they were trying to grow there. When the Romans eventually surround their fortress, they realize that there's no way they can escape. And so the entire town, basically of 1,000 people, commit suicide rather than being killed by the Roman army. It's really, really horrific and is definitely going to stick with me for a very long time, but it was beautifully written. There were 5 or 6 survivors of this event in history, 2 women and 4 children. You don't know till the very end of the story which of the characters you're following are going to be the ones that live to the end of the book, and it was absolutely heart-wrenching. Number 6 is The Midnight Library by Matt Haig. It is a very short, very sweet story. It's about a young woman who in the very first chapter tries to commit suicide. Her life has hit just a really horrible point, and when she wakes up, she is in the Midnight Library, which is a kind of purgatory-esque place, but every book that she picks up is a different life that she could have lived if she had made different choices along the course of her life. And so she goes through these and sees all these different things, and it just gives her a new perspective on the choices that she did make, and how just because you could have made choices that would have made you more successful doesn't necessarily mean that you would have been happier. And it gives her a greater perspective on the life that she did live. So it was very heartwarming and sweet. Number 7 was The Island of Dr. Moreau by H.G. Wells. This is a classic that I read because I was planning to read The Daughter of Dr. Moreau by Silvia Moreno-Garcia, and I wanted to read the original story to have a comparison point and some context for what I was getting myself into. It's a very short story. It's about a man who is out at sea, his ship wrecks, he's the only survivor, and he washes up on this island. When he gets there, it's an island owned by Dr. Moreau, who is basically a mad scientist, and he has created all these animal-human hybrids that live on the island. And it's about him like slowly discovering this and trying to pretend everything is cool and normal, but also trying to figure out a way to escape the island. There's a lot of morality questions at play that H.G. Wells, I think, wanted his audience to think about in terms of what does it mean to be human. And so I found that aspect of the story interesting, but overall found this to be a pretty boring read. I've read 2 other books by H.G. Wells, The War of the Worlds and The Time Machine. I loved both of those, so if you were looking to dip your toes into H.G. Wells, I wouldn't start with the Island of Dr. Moreau. Number 8 was Seveneves. This was included in the Judging My Friends based on their book recommendations. Seveneves by Neal Stephenson is a chunker of a sci-fi story. It is an apocalyptic story about an asteroid that hits the moon. It shatters into several pieces, and then those pieces keep bumping into each other and creating more and more debris, and it rains down on planet Earth and basically wipes out all life. It's about the astronauts that were on the International Space Station when this event took place, and all of the people on Earth that are trying to send up as many rockets full of people and supplies as they can before basically everything on Earth is obliterated so that they can try and save the human race. It has so many awesome, like, philosophical thought experiments. It dives into the psychology of the astronauts as they transition from scientists just doing their job to basically the last survivors of humanity and what that does to a person knowing they're never going to see their friends and family again, that they're stuck with these people for the rest of their lives, all of those sorts of things. Really, really loved all of that aspect of the book, which is about the first 2/3 of the story. It also dives into the different motivations between all these different peoples and governments trying to save humanity and the different ways they go about that. Then the last 1/3 of the book jumps forward about 5,000 years so you can actually see what the fate of humanity was, and it dives into like different races that developed from the survivors that were left and their dynamics. And I found that part to be a little off the rails. Didn't enjoy that nearly as much as the first 2/3, but it was overall a really fantastic read. Number 9 was A Master of Djinn by P. Jolly Clark. This is included in the Gin and Tonic reading blog. This is set in like the 1910s alternate steampunk Cairo. The main character is an agent for a basically magical ministry. She works for the government in Cairo. She's basically like a liaison between the government and the Jinn, and also investigates any time that any crimes happen that seem like some magic was involved. The story kicks off when basically a cult all are found dead in this expensive mansion home, and it seems like their method of death involved some magic, and so it's about our agent's investigation into that. It's also about her kind of struggles as a female agent in the 1910s, and she's assigned a new partner, about their dynamic. And I just really thought the world building and the setting of this was super duper fun and cool. I'm not usually a huge fan of detective type stories, so that was the only kind of hang up that I had about this one, but I thought that it was really, really stunning world building, like I said, and P. Jolly Clark is masterful in the way that he kind of builds up to a climactic conclusion. Number 10 was Silver Nitrate. This is the first Silvia Moreno-Garcia book that I read for the video that was, I binged 7 Silvia Moreno-Garcia books because FOMO. So I tier ranked all 7 of those books, which I'll be talking about here, but you can go check out that video for my more in-depth thoughts. Silver Nitrate is a historical, like, horror thriller about a woman who is a film sound editor in the 1990s, and her best friend. They have kind of a toxic codependent friendship, and they're both huge horror buffs, and they end up meeting a director whose horror films they had seen from back in the day, and they get into a conversation with him and find out that he has an unfinished horror film, and that there are some weird Nazi occult people who are involved in trying to make this film happen, and they agree to help him finish the film, and then magical, horrific things start happening to them. I thought this had a lot of potential, but unfortunately the emphasis was less on the occult Nazi horror and more on the toxic codependent friendship, which I found very realistic, but not as enticing overall. Number 11 was The City of Brass by S.A. Chakraborty, again in the Gin and Tonic reading vlog, where a young woman named Nari is basically like a swindler or a charlatan in Egypt, and she has some unexplained healing powers, but doesn't really examine that too closely. She mostly she does like fortune tellings for rich people. She's doing some sort of like healing seance for a young woman, and she says some like magical, mystical mumbo jumbo words that she doesn't think mean anything, and turns out they did mean something, and it conjured a djinn. The djinn is super pissed about this, and he basically kidnaps her and takes her back to the city of the djinn, the city of brass, which is called Davabad. And once she arrives in Davabad, she's taken straight to the king. She gets wrapped up in all these royal sort of court politics and things that are happening. There's lots of racism between the different types of djinn and the different parts of the city, and turns out that she actually might be descended from some djinn and only be partially human, which explains some of her healing powers, and that she might actually be the descendant of this famous healing family that no one thought had any descendants anymore. This book had just layers and layers of intrigue and politics and social dynamics and interpersonal relationships that I just found absolutely riveting. This was, up to the point that I read this, the best book of the year that I had read so far. And later on in this video, I'll be talking about the continuation of that trilogy. So then I read The Daughter of Dr. Moreau by Silvia Moreno-Garcia. I have a comparison video where I talked about the differences between the doctor and the daughter, and I also included this in the tier ranking video of all the Silvia Moreno-Garcia books. So I won't spend a lot of time talking about this. I didn't really enjoy it. I thought it was pretty boring, and the characters were interesting, but there was really no plot, and I felt like the moral aspects of what H.G. Wells was trying to accomplish in his book didn't come through in Silvia Moreno-Garcia's version of it. Number 13 is The Stardust Thief by Chelsea Abdullah. This is the first book in a brand new trilogy. I believe the second book is coming out next year. This one is about a young woman named the Midnight Merchant. She's really talented at acquiring djinn relics, which are like magical items, and she sells them in the black market. The story really kicks off when she is captured by the king when they do this raid on the black market, and he basically tells her he's going to throw her in jail unless she goes on this quest to find this specific magical relic that he is looking for, and he sends one of the princes, his sons, to go with her. This story was heavily inspired by 1001 Arabian Nights, and I found that aspect of it really interesting, but I also thought the characters were really cool, and I just absolutely love a magical quest. So I'm really excited for the second book in the series. Number 14 was The Beautiful Ones. This is a historical romance by Silvia Moreno-Garcia. It has a little bit of magical realism. It's very Pride and Prejudice-esque. It's about a young woman who goes to live in the city for her debut season to meet eligible bachelors. She falls in love with a young man who has the same magical ability that she does, kind of a telekinesis type of thing, and she is enamored with him right away, but he is actually in love with her cousin, and he's just using her to get closer to her cousin. I thought this was a fun read, but I felt like the magical elements were really underplayed, and since romance really isn't my thing, I just thought this was okay. Number 15 was Mexican Gothic, Silvia Moreno-Garcia's most popular novel. This is a historical horror. Again, it's about a young socialite woman in Mexico. She gets a very strange letter from her cousin, basically a cry for help. This letter just makes it seem like her cousin has descended into madness and has become completely deranged over the course of the years since she married her husband. So the main character goes to live with her cousin to try and figure out what's going on, and the house that her cousin and her cousin's family live in is very creepy and weird. There's like mold and mildew everywhere. She starts having these really strange dreams. The family is very aggressive towards her, and things just kind of spiral as the book goes along. I found the first third of this book to be pretty boring, and then the last 2/3 to be really cool and haunting. It was definitely unsettling and made me very uncomfortable, which I think is exactly what the author was trying to do. Then I read the 5 books for the 5 vampire classics books video that I put out. The first of those was Carmilla by J. Sheridan LeFanu. This is a short novella basically that inspired Dracula. It's kind of a dreamy, sapphic, Gothic story about a young noblewoman who has a carriage wreck in her front yard. There was another young woman about the same age as her who was in the carriage when it wrecked, and they bring her to live with them while she is healing. And right after they do that, the main character starts having all of these weird dreams. She becomes very pale. She starts imagining that their guest is like visiting her at night, and she starts to get very sickly. You can see where this is going. I found it to be a really interesting story, especially for the fact that it's like 150 years old. Definitely worth the read. Then I read Dracula by Bram Stoker. This is the ultimate vampire classic. I found it to be a lot more gruesome and gritty than I expected. Like most classics, it was overly descriptive and slow at times, but I found the story overall to be really engaging, and I was super duper happy that I finally read this. Then I read Salem's Lot by Stephen King. This is a story about a slow vampire takeover of an entire isolated town, and the people who are surviving it trying to figure out what's going on, and by the time they figure out what's going on, if they can do anything about it. It's really just about the entire town's worth of people and what happens to them as they slowly descend into hell. I absolutely loved this one. It was an excellent horror thriller if you're into that. Then I read I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. This is essentially the zombie apocalypse version of a vampire story. It's about a pandemic that had turned everyone in the world into vampire except for the main character, who he believes himself to be the very last human left on Earth. It's his story of survival and vampire hunting and just all of the moral questions that he goes through about being the last person alive, what the meaning of his life even is, if it's even worth it to continue going on, and his interactions that he has with the vampires who are trying to kill him. This was very short. It was very philosophical leaning. Other than the overly horniness of the main character that was emphasized, I felt like this was a pretty perfect read. And the last one for the vampire classics was Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice. This is the story of a vampire. He starts out as a human. He is a plantation owner near New Orleans in the late 1700s. It's about the vampire who turns him and his relationship with that vampire. It's very toxic. It's very codependent and manipulative. It follows him through several centuries of his life as he grapples with the questions of what it means to be a vampire, what his impact on the world is, his relationship with others of his kind, and kind of the meaning of life. It was definitely like a slow character-focused study, but I also didn't want to put it down. I was super intrigued by what was happening and the consequences of his actions as he dealt with all these moral questions about life. All right, we're getting closer to the end. We only have 6 more to go. Okay, after that, I read Velvet Was the Night, which was by Silvia Moreno-Garcia. This is a historical fiction about the early 1970s in Mexico, when the government had a secret branch of people whose job was to rough up leftist-leaning students, break up student protests, and basically make sure that no leftist rose to power. There's 2 kind of perspective characters in this one. One of them is a hawk, which is the name of this like branch of the government. He's basically just a young man whose job is to terrorize student groups. So he was a very interesting and morally gray character to follow. The other main character was a young woman who agrees to cat sit for her neighbor that lives across the hall while her neighbor goes on vacation, and then her neighbor never comes back from vacation, and she finds out that that neighbor might have some incriminating photos of government officials because she was involved with all these student protests that were going on. And so it's about her trying to figure out what happened to her neighbor and all the people that are looking for her and how she gets wrapped up in this big conspiracy. I thought this one was super cool. I didn't really vibe with the main character, which was a knock against the book, but I really thought the story was super fascinating. Then I read The Gods of Jade and Shadow by Silvia Moreno-Garcia. This is a fantasy story based on some Mayan mythology. and it is about a young woman who has a very Cinderella-esque existence. She is very mistreated by her family, and she dreams of a different life for herself. When she uncovers the remains of a Mayan god, and he comes to life before her eyes and basically whisks her away to help him restore himself fully to godhood. She's in for a lot more than she bargained for when this happens. She always wanted adventure, but this doesn't go the way that she thought it would. There is a trip to the Mayan underworld and lots of interesting character dynamics. I really loved this one. Then the last book by Silvia Moreno-Garcia that I read for I binged 7 Silvia Moreno-Garcia books was Certain Dark Things, and this is by far my favorite of her stories. This is set in an alternate Mexico City where vampires are real and humans know about vampires. There's like 10 different types of vampire subspecies, and one of the main characters is the subspecies of vampires that is native to Mexico. It's based on some Aztec mythology, and these vampires are more bird-like. They have talons, they can sprout wings, but it is illegal for vampires to live in Mexico City, and there are different warring factions of vampire cartels around Mexico. Her family is murdered by another vampire cartel, and so she flees to Mexico City to try and escape them, and it's about her struggle to escape Mexico entirely to find somewhere safe to live. She meets a young human man, and it's about their relationship as she tries to navigate escaping the country while at the same time being hunted by other vampire clans. Really thought that all of the different world building and the different vampires was super cool in this one, and I also thought the characters were super compelling. Okay, the last 3 books are the ones that I haven't mentioned in any other video yet so far. The first of those is The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches by Sengu Mandana, and I just absolutely had the best time with this. It was a cozy fantasy romance. It's about a witch in our modern world. She obviously can't let people know that she's a witch, but at the same time, she struggles with that. Magic is a huge part of her life. She loves it so much, and so she creates a YouTube channel basically to show off witchy things and just be like the witchcore aesthetic and things like that, where she's pretending to not be a witch who's pretending to be a witch. She has a decent following, and then she is contacted by a family who say they have 3 young witches who live at this house together, which is illegal for witches to gather in groups like that. And they want her to come train them how to use their magic. So she goes and lives in the house with these 3 young witches, and the adults who live there, their caretakers, the groundskeeper, the librarian, that sort of thing, and just finds a sense of family for the first time in her life and falls in love with the librarian. And it's just so cute and romantic and heartwarming and lovely. And I was just giggling while I was reading it. I thought it was so sweet, and the witchy vibes were on point. I absolutely loved this one. Okay, and then the last 2 books that I read in the month of October were the last 2 books in the Daevabad trilogy, which started with The City of Brass, which I talked about earlier. So the second book is called The Kingdom of Copper by S.A. Chakraborty. I absolutely could not tear my eyes away from these pages. It just, from the very get-go to the very end, I was so living in this world. There was intrigue, there was betrayals, there was rebellion, there was well-laid plans crumbling before our eyes. I was so stressed for these characters. I could not. This book was everything that I wanted. It was the complete opposite of what I think a lot of people consider second book syndrome, where the second book is often just like, oh, here's like a bridge between like the exciting first and the exciting third, and we need stuff to happen in the middle. This was not that at all. This book was everything that I wanted out of a sequel, and I thought even better than the first. And then finally, the 26th book that I read over the last 3 months was The Empire of Gold, the final book in the Daevabad trilogy. This one, I found the start to be a little too slow for my taste. When it ends, our characters have kind of been separated from each other, and it took way too long for everything to come back together, in my opinion. But that being said, I still gave this book 5 stars. It was an absolutely stunning conclusion to the story. I was so worried for these characters and what was happening to them. I don't want to give anything away because, again, it's the second and third book of the trilogy, and anything I say would probably be a spoiler. But there was characters that you felt so morally gray about, and you see them just make such terrible decisions, but that are completely justified based on their own experiences. And my heart just hurt for them so much. And there's romance that you want to happen that just never quite connects, and then it does, and then it doesn't. There's, you know, the complete upheaval of their society. There is mass genocide. There is just so much that goes on. There's old gods and new gods and other species that get involved in this war. It was everything. I definitely teared up at the end. I was so worried about how S.A. Chakraborty was going to handle the ending of these characters, and I honestly cannot think of a better way this could have ended. It was just perfect. It was perfect. This is absolutely the best fantasy series that I have read this year, and it's probably one of my favorites of all time. So what a high note to end this video on. I have already started reading another book. Like I said, it's not quite the last day of the month yet, so I could still finish another book before the end of October, but I'll just include that in my November wrap up when I get around to that. So thank you guys so much for tuning in. I'm not sure how rapid fire this rapid fire wrap up actually was, but I tried to get through it as quickly as I could while still giving you a good taste of what all these books were about. So hopefully I did that. If you've read any of these books, be sure to let me know in the comments below what you thought of them. Or if you haven't read any of these books, just let me know what your favorite book was that you've read over the last 3 months of the year. Thanks so much for tuning in and hanging out with me for a little bit today. As always, please be kind, read books, and hit the subscribe button below for more bookish content to come. I'll see you next time.